every party is thinking about how to sell the situation back home. And this explains the vastly different accounts of the deal being reported in Iranian and US media. But Trump's PR team is not just competing with Iran. They're also competing with ex-US President Barack Obama, whose 2015 nuclear deal with Iran forms a benchmark against which any new deal will be measured. Trump tore up the so-called Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action during his first term as president, and with it, nearly 2 years of negotiations. There is also, of course, what Trump said that he wanted from this war.
We are going to destroy their missiles and raise their missile industry to the ground. It will be totally, again, obliterated. We're going to annihilate their Navy. We're going to ensure that the region's terrorist proxies can no longer destabilize the region or the world. And we will ensure that Iran does not obtain a nuclear weapon. It's a very simple message. They will never have a nuclear weapon. Finally, to the great, proud people of Iran, I say tonight that the hour of your freedom is at hand. When we are finished, take over your government. It will be yours to take. This will be probably your only chance for generations.
My colleague Sean Matthews joins me now. Sean, you just heard it from Trump: ballistic missiles, nuclear weapons, proxies, and regime change. Has Trump achieved any of his stated goals?
Yeah, I think he's striking out on all counts, it looks like. Not only that, but he appears to be making some big concessions to the Iranians. Just before joining, I was texting a friend in the Gulf, a Gulf diplomat, about a report I'm seeing that the U.S. has agreed to waive sanctions on Iranian oil sales. So that looks like it's dropping in real time, and is quite interesting. If the U.S. is going to drop sanctions on any Iranian oil sales, that's a massive concession to make before even entering the negotiating table. And really what's going on here, Matilda, is that Trump looks like he has been boxed into this ceasefire deal or extension of a ceasefire without achieving any of his objectives, because the Iranians have got new chips on the board, basically, with their control of the Strait of Hormuz. So Trump is obviously under the gun going into the summer here, when there's a big driving season in the U.S., when reserves of oil are running out across the globe, especially in the West. Trump is under the gun to kind of get Hormuz open, and he's making concessions to the Iranians. It seems like quite the opposite of his speech.
Yeah, and there's a lot then to ask about how and whether he will successfully sell it at home, not just to his voters, but also to his party, because the war has ruptured factions inside the Trump space between the America First and the sort of hawkish interventionists. I wonder if those divisions are going to play out now, given that this deal essentially depends entirely on Israel and whether Trump restrains or chooses to restrain Israel. He appears to have dragged Tel Aviv into a ceasefire that they don't want to be part of. Israel has expressed its intention to continue on warfare in Lebanon. Does the deal depend on Israel's compliance, the US's ability to restrain Israel? Or is there a scenario in which this marks the end of the US involvement in the war, but actually it could just continue without Trump?
No one I speak with in the region or U.S. officials, I mean, no one in their right mind believes that, the U.S. could walk away, make a deal, and let Israel continue fighting, and that deal would hold. It's the Iranians have been very consistent and very clear that any ceasefire agreement, ceasefire extension has to include Lebanon, which means that the Israelis cannot continue to wage war on Lebanon, with their bombing campaign there. Of course, the Israelis are still entrenched in Lebanon, but in terms of the strikes, Trump needs to rein those Israeli strikes in. That's very clear. And there's no chance, that the Israelis could continue to go to war with Iran without U.S. protection. I mean, as we saw very clearly in the opening months of the conflict and in the previous war, the June 2025 war between Israel and Iran that the U.S. entered late, Israel is dependent on U.S. interceptors, and U.S. air cover. And of course, don't forget, Matilda, right now, Trump has been meeting with officials from the Gulf at the G7 summit. Obviously, those leaders are not part of the G7, but they have come to the conference to meet with Trump. So Trump has sat down with the ruler of Qatar and the UAE. And Trump is under intense pressure from the Gulf states to see to it that Israel kind of abides to the ceasefire and that no fighting flares up again. So on all sides, Trump is really tied to enforcing this ceasefire, and he cannot, walk away and wash his hands of it.
Wow. Okay. So that really puts a lot of pressure on how he handles Netanyahu and how he handles Israel in the coming week. And I suppose that also means a lot remains very fragile with the memorandum of understanding. Do you think that there's a very real risk of it falling through before the signing on Friday?
I mean, we have less than 3 days here. I think that, Israel would surely like it to fall through. Most folks that I speak with in the region and in Washington and in Europe also, they're pretty confident that there will be some kind of a signing on Friday, simply because, Trump has he's come out and announced this. The Pakistanis have kind of doubled down on this. He has met with the Gulf rulers. He has met with the Qataris and the Emiratis now, who have both backed this agreement. So he's boxed himself in. I mean, if it falls through now, it would look pretty bad for Trump. Remember, Trump is also now exercising political capital to defend this deal. Vice President J.D. Vance has taken kind of the front row seat the last 24 hours, going out to U.S. Network television stations, defending the agreement. I think doing some gymnastics to kind of, frame this as a win in terms of the Trump administration's war goals. But he's doing some gymnastics to defend this agreement. So the Trump administration, clearly what we're seeing in these last 48 hours is really invested in this memorandum. And don't forget, I mean, the memorandum you can have a signing ceremony on Friday, and after 60 days, which is kind of the expected timeframe of this agreement, you could have a return to conflict. This is not a permanent ceasefire, or permanent truce. It's a ceasefire.
And something you've already pointed out is that the US has its relationship with the Gulf states to think about. These are relationships that need some repairing. I want to talk about Oman here. Oman is the US's oldest treaty partner in the Gulf. That goes back to 1833. Yet during the war, Trump at one point threatened to blow them up. That's a quote. This was over Oman's refusal to renounce Iran's call to join it in charging a toll in the Strait of Hormuz, as you reported. But despite this tension with the US ally, you argue in a new piece on MEE that Oman is emerging as the biggest winner in this post-war potential world order. How so?
Yeah, well, thank you for drawing attention to the piece. It's one of those great pieces that we do at MEELive where we combine, I think, kind of the diplomatic dealings and the background content that we're hearing from our sources in the U.S. and the region, with just really, really clear-cutting analysis from all sides. We have a good array of voices in that piece. And as you laid out, right, what I wanted to do with that piece was kind of contrast where Oman stood at the beginning of the war. So Trump really, issued a broadside against Oman, threatening to bomb it. Obviously, because there was some frustration, U.S. officials told me that Oman had not unequivocally condemned Iran's call to enforce a toll in the Strait of Hormuz. Obviously, Oman is really central to Iran's ambitions in Hormuz, because Iran and Oman are the two countries whose territorial waters basically comprise the waterway. So if Oman is on board with Iran, Iran has a lot of international kind of, backing to kind of see this through. Potentially not a toll, which would be considered illegal under international law, but an environmental fee or a service fee. We also admittedly cited a fantastic piece during the height of the war, looking at how Iran and Oman could impose that fee in the Strait of Hormuz from a lot of international law experts kind of in maritime law. So what I was told was that basically Trump's threat stemmed from frustration with the Omanis that they did not come out unequivocally and, kind of distance themselves from this Iranian position. Of course, also, right, remember, back in April, there was a big GCC meeting in Jeddah, and the Omanis were notably absent from that meeting. So the Omanis were getting some pressure from their Gulf neighbors as well. And this is interesting, this is from both sides, from the Emiratis and from the Saudis, despite the tensions between the two. When the Iranian kind of missile and drones were really hitting into the Gulf states, Oman was under a lot of pressure to condemn those strikes. And the Omanis, of course, what they did, they issued this statement kind of saying that the U.S. had been dragged into the war by Israel. The Omani foreign minister wrote this, really scathing piece in The Economist magazine, criticizing the U.S. policy. So I laid all that out in the piece. And then what we did was kind of talk to analysts and officials in the region, noting that basically the tables have really turned, and that what's happening right now, it looks like, is that the Gulf states, all of them, the Emiratis, the Saudis, the Qataris, everyone is playing catch up with Oman's position, I would say. Obviously, the Omanis were very conciliatory towards Iran. The Omanis were always opposed to this conflict because they recognized, as the Omani diplomats that I spoke with would say, right, kind of that they are bound to Iran by geography, by shared culture. They had no interest in kind of launching this war. And now the Gulf states are also kind of having to take this conciliatory approach to Iran. Obviously, some states were kind of more forward-leaning than that. Qatar was one of the more forward-leaning ones. The Saudis, although they, they had to walk a very fine line, kind of with the U.S. bases that are in their country, but eventually the Saudis also threw their weight behind diplomacy. But the Omanis, they really kind of were at the forefront of being conciliatory to the Iranians and trying to find a way to work with them. And now it looks like the Gulf states are basically playing catch up with Oman. So the idea for this piece was to show the changing region and to show that Oman really offers a window into understanding the region, and that far from being an outlier, Oman now looks like the trailblazer. There was a report from Reuters recently. I could not confirm it with my sources, but I should say that multiple Gulf officials that I spoke with in many countries in the region and U.S. officials were discussing this story, that the Emiratis have paid billions of dollars to the Iranians, basically in protection money to prevent strife. And that story has been circulated far and wide in the Gulf. And again, I couldn't independently confirm it, but it is the talk of the town, I think, in many Arab capitals and in Washington.
Yeah, we're gonna talk about it more actually in our next interview. And I'm really sorry I have to shut you off, but you have given us a very good segue into our next interview, which will focus on the Gulf more. So Sean Matthews, thank you so much for your time as always. Now, the Gulf region has been the backdrop both to the war and to the makings of this potential peace deal. Iran's retaliation against its US foe has been directed towards its neighbours, who play host to US airbases. This has tested their relationships both with their Iranian neighbour and with their US ally, who initiated a war into which they were dragged against their explicit wishes. The Gulf states' respective roles in the peace negotiations illustrate a world order that is shifting and has shifted over the course of this war. Andreas Krieg is a security studies lecturer at King's College London and Gulf analyst, and he's here to help break it down. Andreas, welcome back to MEELive. Now, along with Pakistan, the Gulf region has been key to the mechanics of this deal. Though they've taken different postures during the conflict, it does appear most have played some role in the deal's formulation. Why are Gulf Arab states appearing overwhelmingly in support of the deal? Is this an expression of support for the US and for Trump?
Absolutely not. I think this is out of pure pragmatism and understanding the sort of complexities of the security environment that they're in. They're in a shared geography with Iran, and that is not going to change. Even a country like the UAE, which is very closely aligned with Israel, understands that there is no escape from this quite superior force to their north in Iran, and also that they understand that there isn't anyone who's going to come and help them. The United States have not they were not a protector of the GCC, and much more have probably put them on the target list of the Iranians. So in the context of all of that, knowing that Trump is also really not a deal maker as he promised to be, they understood that the only way out is pulling together and saying, okay, we need to find a deal to get back to trade and opening up the Strait of Hormuz, which is exactly what the primary objective of all of this is, because otherwise a frozen conflict with the Strait of Hormuz closed is obviously going to be detrimental to their wealth and their prosperity. But obviously, even in that, there are different positions. I think it's quite clear that Qatar has played an immensely powerful role in the background. They've tried to keep it silent. They've tried to stay in the shadows, giving Pakistan the lead. But actually, a lot of the negotiation that's been going on over the last 2 weeks has gone on either through Doha or by Qatari diplomats flying to Islamabad, flying to Tehran in order to broker this MOU.
Qatar certainly seems to have played a really key role mediating, but not just Qatar. Actually, the FT reported a detailed outline of the process. We see Saudi and Emirati leaders collectively calling the US president as he repeatedly wavers over resuming all-out warfare. So as you point out, it is a sort of real coming together. And that wasn't always a given. If we look at the UAE, in the United Arab Emirates, there is certainly today some opposition to the deal, a growing sense that Tehran has gained leverage over the course of this war. And during the war, the UAE not only launched dozens of strikes on the Islamic Republic, but tried to prevent Pakistan from mediating between Tehran and Washington. However, on the other hand, we just heard from my colleague Sean, and it was reported in Reuters as well, that the UAE agreed to pay Iran billions of dollars to stop attacking it. We've seen Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps officials invited over by security advisor in the UAE. So the UAE has denied these reports. Nevertheless, they seem to be the talk of the town, to quote my colleague Sean. How do we make sense of this pivot on the part of the UAE?
I think the UAE is probably the most interesting one because they have really shifted on that continuum. Which at the beginning of the war, we had Oman on one side, very clear that they played the neutrality card. Diplomacy was the only way forward. At the other end of the spectrum, we had the UAE that at that time was talking about defiance, strength, projecting strength. It was about coercion. It was about deterrence, and now, obviously, they pulled out $3 billion from Pakistan as a punishment for Pakistan taking a more conciliatory approach towards Iran. And now it seems they've come around to actually embrace the MOU and the diplomatic process, supporting the Qatari efforts. What is quite interesting in all of that is that there is tension going on clearly within Abu Dhabi and also between Abu Dhabi and the Northern Emirates over how to deal with Iran. The MBZ, the president's position, has been that of defiance, of strength, of deterrence rather than entanglement and engagement. And then you have Tahnoun bin Zayed, who suddenly reappeared on the surface. I mean, he'd been nowhere to be seen for months, has now come back to kind of lead on that policy issue. And it has been his sort of strategic mindset, this idea of entanglement, engagement, weaponized interdependence through commercial networks, that kind of led the sort of policy in the UAE to say, look, we allow the Iranians, we allow the IRGC to do business in the UAE, and thereby in return, we will not be attacked. That clearly didn't, this kind of equation didn't in the end come to fruition. But nonetheless, there was no alternative. Tahnoun bin Zayed put his foot down and said, look, we cannot win this militarily. Israel is not there to win the war for us because they can't win the war for themselves. The US doesn't want an all-out war. The GCC, the partners around us, don't want a war. So we really have no option but to come to the negotiation table. And it seems that Tahnoun has won this part of the conflict over MBZ's approach, which was far more assertive early on. And again, the idea being that maybe a united GCC position is far better for national interest in the UAE than one where everyone pulls into opposite directions.
For Iran's part, what does Iran need to do to re-earn the trust of its neighbours? We've seen these huge conciliatory strides made, this great cooperation by the GCC in trying to re-establish peace and stability in the region. What about Iran? What does Iran need to do as a show of faith to the Gulf?
The number one sticking point, the one issue that we all need to think about and that the GCC is thinking about is freedom of navigation around the Strait of Hormuz. The Iranians have to show not just goodwill, but they have to stick to international law and really show that they will open up the Strait of Hormuz to allow free passage and trade to the GCC from the GCC to then reboost the global economy, but obviously also specifically energy markets. And so it has to be made very clear that there is now a way for shipping companies to go through the strait. I think that's the number one thing. But it's I think, too premature to just think about rebuilding trust. I think whatever trust was there before the war has completely evaporated now on all sides. I would even include Oman in this. The idea that now the GCC will just return to a situation ex ante is just not going to happen. And also Qatar, which had a long-standing relationship with Iran, is now really has to focus on how to manage that relationship. I think the realization, though, is it is one of interconnectivity. It's one of shared geography. But ultimately, the Iranians will have to show that they mean business. And mind you, there's still a lot of voices in Iran who are pushing back against this deal, who are pushing back against the MOU. And those people might still, these hardliners might win over those who were more pragmatic in kind of getting into an MOU. So trust is not there, and it will take years to rebuild, if that.
Andreas Krieg, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us here today.